For decades, Judge Caroline Monroe carried a reputation like iron armor. In her courtroom, there was no room for tears, no shades of forgiveness. She believed justice meant punishment unflinching, absolute. So when a black inmate named Jonathan Blake stood before her with only hours to live, he didn't beg. He didn't demand mercy. He asked for something so unexpected it ignited a storm of outrage in the courtroom. He asked not for a plea to be spared, but to record a message. For his daughter. Someone he'd never been able to speak to from behind bars. It was a request Judge Monroe had never considered, and one that threatened to crack her impenetrable sternness wide open. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was Marcus Reed? And why was he sitting on death row, staring at the final hours of his life with the weight of a nation's justice pressing down on his shoulders? To the world, Marcus Reed was just another name in the system, another inmate destined to be erased from existence. His crimes etched into the record books as cold facts. But to those who dared to look closer, Marcus wasn't just a headline. He was a man who had grown up in the cracks of America, molded by hardship, mistakes, and a justice system that gave little room for redemption. And yet, as his last sunrise approached, he didn't plead for freedom. He didn't demand to see the outside world again. Instead, he made a request so extraordinary, so unexpected, that it stopped Judge Eleanor Whitman, known to every lawyer and defendant as the Black Robe, in her tracks. What could a man with nothing left to lose possibly ask for that would shake a woman who had built her career on cold discipline? Why would Judge Whitman, a figure whose name struck fear in every courtroom she presided over, even consider risking her ironclad legacy to grant it? This wasn't just about law. It was about power, mercy, and the thin line between justice and humanity. And once you hear what happened next, you'll never forget it. Judge Eleanor Whitman was a woman defined by the law. For over 2 decades, her reputation was carved in stone across every courthouse corridor: stern, unwavering, unbending. Lawyers whispered her nickname with a mix of dread and respect: the Black Robe. She had no patience for excuses, no sympathy for tears. Defendants learned quickly that pleading with her was like pleading with granite. To Eleanor, crime was crime, and punishment was its only answer. She built her career on this iron-fisted philosophy, and it earned her both admiration from the public and fear from those who stood accused before her bench. But what few people knew was that her obsession with discipline and consequence had roots in something far more personal. When Eleanor was just 17, her father had been killed in a hit-and-run. The man responsible walked away with a light sentence, a moment that shaped Eleanor's belief that mercy was weakness and justice, true justice, could never be compromised. Marcus Reed's story could not have been more different. Born on the other side of the tracks, his life was one long uphill climb against poverty, broken schools, and neighborhoods where survival came before dreams. Marcus was not born violent, but he was shaped by desperation. By his early 20s, he had drifted into bad company and worse choices, slipping further into the shadows of crime. It all came crashing down one night during a robbery that was never meant to turn deadly. Michael Caldwell, a young father of 2, full of energy and promise, crossed Marcus's path. A struggle broke out, a gun went off, and in an instant, Michael was gone. The shockwaves of that moment shattered 2 families forever. Michael's mother, Mrs. Caldwell, carried her grief with a quiet stoicism. To the world she was strong, but behind closed doors the weight of her son's absence hollowed her out. She became a symbol of every parent who had buried a child because of violence. And then there was Lily, Marcus Reed's daughter. Barely a year old when her father was sentenced, she grew up with only photographs and faded letters as reminders of the man she barely knew. By the time Marcus faced his final hours, Lily was 7 years old, innocent, full of questions about the father she had never been able to hug. Judge Eleanor Whitman, the Black Robe. Marcus Reed, the condemned. Michael Caldwell, the victim whose future had been stolen. And 2 families, bound together by a crime that neither could ever escape. But no one in that courtroom knew that Marcus Reed's final request would force Eleanor Whitman to confront her own buried grief, a grief she had hidden behind rulings and verdicts for over 20 years. On a bitter winter night nearly a decade earlier, Marcus Reed's life collided with Michael Caldwell's in a way that neither man could have foreseen. Marcus was desperate, broke, and running with men who promised him fast money. That night, the plan was simple. A quick robbery at a corner store on the south side of town. No one was supposed to get hurt. But plans made in desperation often unravel in chaos. Michael Caldwell, a 28-year-old father of two who had just left work and stopped by for a pack of diapers, walked through the door at the wrong moment. What happened next was pieced together later through eyewitness testimony and frantic 911 calls. Shouting filled the store, a gun was waved, and panic spread. Michael, caught in the confusion, tried to shield a terrified cashier. In the scuffle, a single shot cracked through the air. When the smoke cleared, Michael lay on the floor, his life slipping away before help could arrive. Sirens cut through the night, neighbors rushed to the scene, and within minutes the store was surrounded by flashing blue and red lights. Witnesses pointed, names were shouted, and Marcus Reed was wrestled to the ground by officers who dragged him away in handcuffs. The trial that followed was swift, the evidence stacked high against him. Prosecutors painted Marcus as reckless, dangerous, and beyond redemption. The grieving face of Mrs. Caldwell sat in the front row every day, a silent reminder of the son she had lost. And presiding over it all, in her high-backed chair, was Judge Eleanor Whitman, the Black Robe. She listened without flinching as defense attorneys tried to argue that Marcus had never intended to kill, that the shooting had been an accident in a botched robbery. But Eleanor had seen too many of these cases, too many excuses. To her, intent did not erase the finality of death. Michael Caldwell was gone, and someone had to be held accountable. In that courtroom, the air was thick with grief and rage. The jury delivered their decision after hours of deliberation, guilty of murder in the commission of a felony. And when the time came for sentencing, Judge Whitman's voice cut through the silence like steel. No hesitation, no wavering. Her words were cold, deliberate, final. The verdict was clear. The sentence was death. And on this day, the clock was running out. The years that followed Marcus Reed's conviction unfolded like a grim calendar, each day marked by the ticking of a clock that could never be stopped. Death row is not swift. It is a place where time stretches, where appeals crawl through the system, and where every letter, every petition becomes another desperate attempt to claw back even a fragment of hope. Marcus's legal team filed motion after motion, arguing that his crime, while tragic, was never premeditated. They pushed for his sentence to be reduced to life without parole, citing flaws in the investigation, the chaos of the robbery, and Marcus's difficult upbringing. Each time their efforts were met with the same unyielding response: denied. The public followed the case with fierce division. To some, Marcus Reed was nothing more than a killer, a man who had stolen the future of Michael Caldwell, leaving a young father's children to grow up without him. To others, he was a symbol of a system too rigid, too quick to discard men who had grown up with little chance to choose a different path. Editorials filled the newspapers, talk shows debated his fate, and activists marched outside courthouses, their voices clashing in protest and defense. Yet through it all, one figure remained constant: Judge Eleanor Whitman. The Black Robe. She never wavered, never bent, never allowed emotion to cloud her rulings. For her, the law was a shield, not a suggestion, and every time Marcus's name came across her desk, she ruled with the same icy precision. Justice, as she saw it, demanded nothing less. But now the calendar had run out. It was October 12th, a cold and quiet morning, when Marcus Reed was led once more into the courtroom where his life had first unraveled. Shackled, thinner than he had once been, his eyes carried the weight of years spent waiting for an end he could not stop. The room was crowded: journalists, activists, family members of both sides. Mrs. Caldwell sat in the same seat she had occupied during the trial, her face lined with grief, but hardened by time. And high above them all, Judge Eleanor Whitman took her seat, the black robe flowing around her as if the years had not touched her resolve. This was not a trial. There would be no jury, no long deliberations. This was procedure, a final confirmation before the sentence was carried out. Everyone expected Marcus Reed to make one last desperate plea for his life, to beg for clemency, to cry for mercy. But when the judge gave him the chance to speak, Marcus did not tremble. Instead, he reached slowly into his pocket. The guards stiffened, hands on their holsters, the air snapping tight with tension. And in that moment, the entire courtroom froze. Because instead of begging for his life, Marcus pulled something from his pocket, and the entire courtroom froze. The tension in the room was suffocating as Marcus Reed's chained hands moved deliberately, pulling from his pocket a small, crumpled object that looked like it had been carried for years. It wasn't a weapon, nor a letter to beg for freedom. It was a photograph. The edges were worn, the ink slightly faded, but the image was unmistakable. It was of a little girl, Lily, his daughter. The daughter he had never held outside of a prison visiting room. The daughter who was now 7 years old, growing up with nothing more than fragments of a father locked away by iron bars. The room collectively exhaled in confusion, unsure what he intended to say. The guards relaxed their grip, and Judge Eleanor Whitman, the Black Robe, stared down at Marcus with eyes that had seen countless pleas, countless theatrics, but never something quite like this. He raised the photo high enough for her to see it clearly, his voice trembling yet steady in its purpose. "I don't want mercy," he said. "I don't want freedom. I want 20 minutes. 20 minutes to record a message for my daughter, to tell her who her father was, what mistakes I made, and how I hope she never walks the path I walked. That's all I want." The courtroom erupted. Gasps filled the air, followed immediately by sharp voices. The prosecution slammed their papers down, furious at what they saw as nothing more than an emotional stunt, an insult to the memory of Michael Caldwell. "Your Honor, this is outrageous," the lead prosecutor barked. "This man had 7 years to write letters. He had 7 years to find his voice. This is nothing more than manipulation, an attempt to taint his punishment with pity." On the other side, journalists scribbled furiously, the room buzzing with disbelief. And then, Judge Eleanor Whitman, the Black Robe, did something no one expected. She froze, her usually unshakable expression flickering with something human. For a moment, she wasn't the cold arbiter of law, but a woman staring into a mirror of her own past. In her mind, she was 12 years old again, standing beside her mother as they buried her father. She remembered the emptiness, the unanswered questions, the words she wished she had heard from him before he was gone. A message, a voice, a memory to hold on to. What would it have meant if she had something, anything, to cling to on the nights when the silence felt unbearable? Her hands tightened around the gavel, her mind waging war against itself. To grant Marcus Reed's request would mean stepping outside the rigid armor she had built for decades, risking her reputation as the judge who never bent. But to deny it meant forcing a child Lily to grow up with the same silence she herself had carried all her life. As the tension reached its breaking point, a sound cut through the noise. Mrs. Caldwell, the mother of the victim, slowly rose from her seat. The courtroom hushed at once, all eyes turning to the grieving woman who had every reason to despise Marcus Reed. And with a voice trembling yet powerful, she said something that no one, least of all, Judge Eleanor Whitman, was prepared to hear. The victim's mother stood up. And what she said changed everything. The silence in that courtroom was heavy, the kind of silence that carries more weight than shouting ever could. All eyes were locked on Mrs. Caldwell, the woman who had every reason to demand vengeance, every right to despise the man sitting before her in chains. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the strap of her handbag, her voice unsteady at first, but gathering strength with each word. "Your Honor," she said softly, her gaze fixed not on Judge Eleanor Whitman, but on Marcus Reed. For years I thought of him as nothing more than the man who took my son away. I have watched him sit in this courtroom with his head lowered, and I have seen the look in his eyes. I know regret when I see it. I know what it means to carry grief. My granddaughter, she lost her father too. She will grow up without his voice, without his words, and I would give anything to change that. If his daughter deserves to hear her father's voice one last time, I won't stand in the way. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and even the prosecution looked momentarily stunned, their arguments caught in their throats. The prosecutor recovered quickly, stepping forward with a sharp objection. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Granting such a request undermines the severity of this court's judgment. The families of victims deserve closure, not spectacle. His words echoed, but for once they felt hollow against the tide of human truth rising in the room. Judge Eleanor Whitman, the Black Robe, sat frozen, her mind battling between decades of precedent and the one moment of humanity pulling at her heart. For 23 years she had never bent, never allowed her personal emotions to blur the rigid lines of justice. Yet here she was, faced with a choice not written in law books, but etched into her own soul. She saw Marcus's daughter, Lily, in her mind. She saw herself at 12 staring into the dark hole of her father's absence, wishing for a voice that never came. She looked at Marcus, at Mrs. Caldwell, at the crowded room filled with people holding their breath, and for the first time in her long career, Eleanor Whitman broke the mask of the Black Robe. Objection overruled, she said firmly, her voice carrying a weight that silenced the prosecutor mid-sentence. This court will grant the request. 20 minutes, no more, no less. The room erupted, some in outrage, some in awe, some in quiet sobs. Marcus Reed bowed his head, his chained hands shaking as he clutched the worn photo of Lily. They brought in a small recorder, the kind used for depositions, and placed it on the table in front of him. With trembling lips, Marcus began to speak, his voice breaking through the years of silence. Lily, it's your daddy. I don't have much time, but I want you to know that I love you. I want you to know that every mistake I made was mine, not yours. I was young, I was foolish, and I let anger and desperation guide me down the wrong road. Don't follow me down that road. Be better than me. Be stronger than me. Always remember your worth, and know that even in my last breath, you are the best part of my life. I am sorry for the pain I caused. I am sorry for the man I could not be. But if you remember nothing else, remember this. I love you more than life itself. Tears streamed silently down Mrs. Caldwell's face as she listened, clutching her handbag tighter, perhaps thinking of her own granddaughter, who would never hear her father's voice again. Judge Eleanor Whitman sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable, though behind her stern eyes a storm of buried grief and reluctant compassion raged. For 20 minutes the courtroom listened not to a criminal, not to a case, but to a father, a flawed and broken man trying to leave something behind. And when the recorder clicked off, the room sat in stunned silence, knowing they had witnessed something no verdict could ever capture. Justice had been served years before, but in that moment, humanity had been given one final chance to speak. In that courtroom, justice and mercy collided in a way no one could have foreseen. Judge Eleanor Whitman, the woman whose very nickname the Black Robe stood for unbending law, broke from the image she had carried for more than 2 decades. She granted a dying man's request not for himself but for the little girl who would one day listen to his final words. Marcus Reed's fate was sealed long before this day, but his last message became a gift, a fragment of truth, for his daughter Lily. Some will call it weakness, others will call it humanity. And for those who sat in that room, the memory of those 20 minutes will remain etched in silence long after the gavel fell. But the question remains, was justice truly served? Did Eleanor Whitman betray her iron principles? Or did she finally allow herself to remember that justice is more than punishment? It is also the legacy we leave for those who come after us? What do you think? Should a man on death row be given a final chance to speak to his child? Let us know in the comments. We want to hear your thoughts. And if you thought this story was powerful, wait until you hear what happened in our next case, where a single decision in a courtroom changed not just one life, but an entire community. Before we dive deeper next time, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story.